All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrew Doffney. I'm the Instruction and Outreach Librarian at the New Jersey State Library. Here with us today, we also have Cindy Warwick, who does a fantastic job for all of our author talks. And our guest speaker today is Carol Simon Levin. So first, a couple housekeeping items first. If you would like to contact Carol at all, her email as well as her website is on the screen here. And I will be sure to send that out in the chat during the presentation so you all have access to it. And then for those of you who are new to GoToWebinar, this should be what your dashboard looks like. If you don't see this, look for this orange box with a white arrow, either at the top left or right-hand side of your screen. That will open and close the dashboard. Some key things to look out for today are this button here that shows a raised hand. If you're having any problems throughout the presentation, you can click on that. We'll be alerted to it, and hopefully I'll be able to help you with that. And then you can submit questions using the question box here. So you can just type your question in, that'll get sent to us, and we'll be answering questions at the end of the program today, unless there's something really pressing that needs to be addressed. So that is everything that I have for you. So I'm going to turn it over now to Cindy for the introduction.
Well, welcome everybody. We're glad that you can be with us today virtually. I do miss seeing the faces when we meet, on site, but this is great that we can do this, and I'm excited about our talk. We're here today especially to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, and the talk is Reclaiming Our Voice, New Jersey's Role in the Fight for Women's Suffrage. Okay, time out for an ad, as you know, but it's an ad that we really want you to check our website. Andrew does a great job as well in programming the webinars. So, check out those things. They're usually from noon to 1. Sometimes there's an alternate time, but just check that out. August 13th, we have coming up Gentle Yoga. And then on August 18th is Researching New Jersey and Civil War Ancestors. And we have a couple other ones there. We usually have quite a few throughout the month, so please check them out. It's very easy to register for them, so that shouldn't be any problem. And you can always call our reference desk if it is. Our next author talk is going to be on September 16th and is with Gary Soretsky, and it's entitled Ere the Shadows Fade. And it's a talk on New Jersey Civil War photographers. So he's going to tell us about some of those who have taken both war pictures as well as family pictures that were so needed there in the Civil War era. Today, though, I'm really, like I said, excited to introduce to you Carol Simon Levin, who is a retired librarian, author, storyteller, and program presenter based in Bedminster, New Jersey. And whether she is impersonating the woman who helped to build the Brooklyn Bridge, telling the amazing stories of early women in aviation, engaging families in a rousing Halloween hootenanny of songs and stories, expanding on the mathematical and artistic possibilities of a simple square, or sharing the story of a dolphin who learned to swim with an artificial tail, she creates exciting programs that engage her audience's interest and expand their horizons. And we hope that she's going to do that today. I have full confidence in that. But as you can see, she has a very well-rounded topic of programming. Recently, she authored Remembering the Ladies, which from patriots in petticoats to presidential candidates. And she's created 3 programs from that book. That book also is a little bit of a different book. It's a coloring book, but it has information on all the different people in there. So it's not necessarily a child's coloring book, though children can definitely learn from it and she's used a lot of the illustrations are wonderful as well. But she's created 3 programs from that book. One of them is today's programs and talking about women's rights in this country. And today she's going to be doing this as she portrays Lillian Feickert, president of the New Jersey Woman Suffrage Association from 1912 to 1920. For more information, you saw that, you can visit her at her website, which is www.tellingherstories.com. Please welcome with me Carol Simon Levin as she portrays Lillian Feickert.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Cindy. And Cindy and Andrew, let me get the right screen so that you see it. This should be it. Is everybody seeing the screen here? Reclaiming Our Voice?
Yep, looks good.
Great, okay. Splendid. And I'm just trying to figure out if there's a way. Yeah, I'm just hiding the control panel. And okay, now what happened to, now are you still seeing it? Because I'm just seeing me. Let's see, here we go. Lovely. All right, again, thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you so much, Cindy. And thank you so much to everyone who's come today. I didn't get to see you ahead of time the way I would have if we'd all been face to face, and I'm not going to get to see you during this program and find out whether I'm making you laugh, groan, or fall asleep. So I hope it's more of the first two and less of the latter. But if anything occurs to you during the program, I urge you to jot something in chat or in the question and answer, because after the program, I hope this will engender some discussion. So with that said, we will get started. And my program today is called Reclaiming Our Voice, New Jersey's Overlooked Role in the Fight for Women's Suffrage. And I hope after this program today, you'll see why I chose this title. All right, let's see, here we go. So today's program is about the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which we bandy about a lot, but many people don't know the wording. It's very simple. It says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And as Cindy remarked, it was achieved 100 years ago. Some people say it was given 100 years ago. Today I'm going to tell you it was not given at all. It was won, and it was a hard, long war to get it. Generations of women and some sympathetic men worked toward that. And most national discussions of it overlook New Jersey's very prominent role in the struggle. So today we're going to focus on it. And today I portray Lillian Feickert. So close your eyes, open them again, and now you see me here. I was born over 150 years ago in 1877 in Brooklyn, New York. So I'm not a Jersey girl, but in 1902, at the ripe old age, and I mean ripe old age for those days, of 25, I got married. I married a New York City banker who soon became a New Jersey banker, and we moved from bustling Brooklyn to bucolic Plainfield. I spent my early days here as a typical suburban housewife involved in various local clubs and organizations, my home, my garden, my church, women's temperance, and so forth. And then I got drawn into the women's suffrage movement. And by 1910, I was recruited to be the chair of the enrollment in New Jersey. And after that, my husband accused me of eating, drinking, sleeping, and dreaming women's suffrage. But of course, the struggle did not begin with me. I like to think it began 101 years before my birth with a letter that Abigail Adams wrote to her husband John, who was a delegate at the Continental Congress, in which she said, and by the way, in the new code of laws, I desire you would remember the ladies. Do not put such unlimited power into their husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. She went on to demand, if particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. He replied that she was, and I quote, so saucy, and the new laws of the new land would not be particularly female friendly, with one very interesting exception right here in New Jersey. Our first state constitution, ratified July 2nd, 1776, stated that all inhabitants of this colony of full age who are worth 50 pounds shall be entitled to vote. By not explicitly stating white male, it implicitly enfranchised some women, blacks, and aliens. And 50 pounds wasn't a prohibitive amount of money. It's estimated about 95% of white males of the time would qualify. Married women could not vote, however, no matter how wealthy the family was, because they were property according to English common law. They could not hold property in their own right. But after the Revolutionary War, which was, of course, like all wars, very bloody, approximately 5% of landowners were women, either widows or single women who never married. And in the early years, it appears that there was a great deal of enthusiasm. Local papers wrote enthusiastic remarks. The Sentinel of Freedom out of Newark wrote this poem saying, "New Jersey hail, now one and all proclaim the fall of tyrants, open wide your throats and welcome in the peaceful scene of government in petticoats." But not everybody was so happy. A so-called friend of the ladies wrote in the Trenton True American, "Female reserve and delicacy are incompatible with the duties of a free elector. A female politician is subject to ridicule." Well, in 1807, there was a hotly contested election in Newark, and there were in Essex County, and there was a big debate about where a courthouse should be, and the courthouse instead, there were so many votes that it's estimated 3 to 6 times as many votes as there were voters. And some people said that people who were voting were men dressing up as women and voting multiple times. But instead of prosecuting those cross-dressers, the New Jersey legislature, all male of course, passed a law in 1807 to reinterpret, as they said, New Jersey's constitution, saying that only free white male citizens over 21 would be allowed to vote. Now, you're not actually allowed to amend a constitution by law, but that didn't stop them and nobody challenged it in court. And so by this act, New Jersey women and African Americans lost their ability to vote. And the 1844 Constitution in New Jersey was amended to enshrine that in law. There you go. I have a slide that seems to have been suppressed. I'm sorry about that. I should mention we do have evidence that women did vote, recently uncovered, which showed women from Somerset County. They found some old rolls, and about 14% of the people on the rolls were women, including at least one identified as Negro, the term at the time, which said his property consisted of 1 cattle and 1 dog. We don't know if there were more. But in any event, women law in New Jersey joined their sisters in all the rest of the states in not having any voting rights. And instead of speaking out for themselves, they started speaking out for slaves. And in the late 1820s and in the 1830s, women joined the abolition movements in great numbers and started speaking out. And one of the prominent women in that movement was Lucretia Mott, who was in Philadelphia and started the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. They had a convention in 1838 which consisted of both white and black women, which was considered so outrageous that people who didn't believe in this burnt down the hall, Penn Hall, in which they were attending. In any event, Lucretia, along with her husband, attended the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention in London as delegates, where they met Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her husband. She was on her honeymoon and he was a delegate. But delegate or not, Lucretia and Elizabeth were both forced, along with all other women, to sit in the spectators gallery and have no formal role in the convention. And Elizabeth later wrote in her journal that they walked home that first day arm in arm, resolving to hold a convention as soon as they returned home and form a society to advocate for the rights of women. Well, it would take 8 years. But finally, in 1848, Lucretia was visiting her sister in Auburn, New York, and went to a tea party. I like to call it the second tea party in American history, with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and 3 other Quaker women. Elizabeth was the only non-Quaker. And they, at that tea party, decided to hold that convention less than 2 weeks hence. Let's do it while strike while the iron is hot. And Elizabeth started writing a document, a declaration of sentiments and resolutions, based on the recently read aloud document, because this was July, of the Declaration of Independence. So she used the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." Well, the document outlined a number of grievances and demands that women were making to have control of their own lives, including, in the case of working women, their control of their wages and the property brought into marriage and their children, because a drunken husband could drink up the family earnings, so they had no rent money or food money, and then while the woman could leave, she could not bring her children because they were the custody of her husband. Uh, all of these resolutions passed with overwhelming acclaim, except for one, which was very controversial, and that was the right to vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton said it was necessary, in that she was supported by Frederick Douglass, the only African American in attendance. But Lucretia Mott thought it was too big an ask. She said, "Thee will make us ridiculous." Well, that led to a decade of annual conventions on abolition and women's rights. And at the first national convention in 1850, Lucy Stone and her friend Antoinette Brown were in attendance. The two of them had met while studying Greek and Latin at Oberlin, the first female college, the first co-ed educational and interracial college in the country. And one of the reasons they studied those ancient languages was to find out if the Bible actually said what the ministers proclaimed, that women were not allowed to speak in public. And they found that no, in translation, it really said women were not allowed to have idle chatter in church, which is a very different thing indeed. Antoinette Brown would go on to be the first female ordained minister in the country, and Lucy Stone would become a national speaker for abolition, temperance, and women's rights. And as I said, she spoke at the first national convention in Worcester, Massachusetts, and Susan B. Anthony was in the audience. And Susan B. Anthony heard the speech and was drawn to women's suffrage work. And a year later, she would meet Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and that would lead to a 50-year partnership. Now, Elizabeth was married. In fact, she had 7 children, keeping her pretty busy at home. Susan remained single all her life, so she had the ability to travel and was an excellent speaker. So Elizabeth would write the speeches, and Susan would take them on the road. Or as Elizabeth's husband quipped, Susan stirred the puddings, Elizabeth stirred up Susan, and then Susan stirs up the world. Well, in the mid-1850s, Lucy and Antoinette marry brothers, Henry and Samuel Blackwell, and they both moved to New Jersey. They're both very progressive. Lucy keeps her own name, and women who follow her example become known as Lucy Stoners. And Reverend Antoinette has 7 children, but they all become Brown Blackwells, and her husband shares housework. Well, in any event, Lucy bought their home in Orange with her money. And when the tax man came by, she refused to pay. She said, "No taxation without representation." He says, "No problem." And he impounds their household goods to sell at tax auction, which fortunately were bought by neighbors and returned. But this protest gets widely publicized in reform circles. That same year, a Quaker from Shrewsbury, New Jersey, named Harriet Lefevre, leads a number of residents of Monmouth County in petitioning the state legislature for women's rights and women's suffrage. And their response of the assembly is that it would be a task in comparison of which the labors of Hercules sink into insignificance to revise the state statutes. And they went on to say that it was contrary to the subordinate position of women to men ever since that first woman, Eve, had introduced sin into the world, and said the task of ruling rightly belongs to men because of the Bible. Well, protests and lectures and conventions continued throughout the decade, but were brought to a stop with the Civil War. Labor shortages and patriotism led women to fill in the gap, as they do so many times during wartime. They sewed uniforms, they did filing and record keeping for the government, they nursed soldiers, Clara Barton, of course, and they kept homes, farms, and businesses going while the men went a-warring, and they expected their competence and patriotism would be rewarded after the war. But it wasn't. In 1866, the women's rights activists joined forces with their former abolitionist allies to form a new group called the American Equal Rights Association, with the goal of gaining equal rights, particularly the right of suffrage, to all adults in the United States, regardless of race or sex. And in 1867, New Jersey held its first statewide universal suffrage convention. It was held in Vineland, New Jersey, which was a hotbed of activism, a progressive community, and a utopian community that had been founded between Philadelphia and Atlantic City. And at that convention, they elected Lucy Stone its first president, and she had organized suffrage societies all over the state in the previous year. Well, Vineland, as I said, was already a hotbed of activism, and I just want to introduce you to two really fun women. Susan Pecker Fowler, who was a teacher, merchant, and blueberry farmer there. She stayed single all her life, and she was a great believer in the costume that we know as the Bloomer costume. In fact, Amelia Bloomer, who was the editor of the Lily, had introduced Susan B. Anthony to Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1851 in Seneca Falls, and she published these patterns. But Susan Pecker Fowler was a great advocate and wore this outfit all her life. She also wrote annual letters to the newspaper for over 40 years protesting taxation without representation. And she and her friend Mary Tillotson would organize an anti-fashion convention promoting this American costume, as they called it, in 1874. Back to Lucy in 1867. Lucy goes before the legislature and gives a lengthy address, which you can read online, urging them to submit to the people of New Jersey an amendment to strike out both white and male in the state constitution, and addresses some of their arguments. It said women would vote as their husbands and brothers do. What's the problem? If women don't want to vote, no problem. If women want to vote, they will want to hold office. Well, Queen Victoria is doing a great job on the other side of the pond. But of course, the legislature did nothing. In the following year, she and her sister-in-law, Antoinette, petitioned the legislature for voting and property rights, for married women to be able to dispose of any of the property they did have, and a widow have rights to her husband's estate during her life. But they were mocked. Women should not drag their shining skirts in the polluting mire of politics. And one legislator said that no person is qualified to vote unless they're familiar with the appearance, sex, and size of that noble animal, the shad. So they said you had to be able to fish to vote. Well, in March of 1868, Mrs. Portia Gage tried to offer her ballot at the polls at Vinland, but she's not registered, so it's returned. And then in September, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had just recently moved to Tenafly, New Jersey, speak on women's rights in Vineland. And on November 3rd, 1868, 172 women, including 4 what were then called colored women, attempt to vote in Vineland, New Jersey. They're not allowed to place their ballots in the regular ballot box, and they say, no problem, we brought our own. And if museums ever open again, you'll be able to see the box they used. It's on display at the Vineland Historical and Antiquarian Society. Well, this attempt to vote was reported in Stanton and Anthony's brand new newspaper, The Revolution, and Lucy Stone and her mother-in-law attempted to vote in Newark in that same election. Well, in 1869, Lucy creates a petition to the men and women of America saying every woman or man should sign this who's not satisfied while women, idiots, felons, and lunatics are the only classes excluded from the exercise of suffrage. At working women who are not getting paid fairly, the wife who has no custody of her children or her earnings, all of them should sign it. But on the national stage, the 14th and 15th Amendments give the vote to Black men only. And for the first time, the word man appears in the Constitution. Before that, citizen was gender neutral. It was assumed man, perhaps to be male, but it didn't explicitly say so. And Frederick Douglass, who'd been so supportive of Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1848, says it's the Negro's hour, that the Congress will never pass an amendment that includes women, and and so we need to satisfy for half a pie right now, women, just the Black vote. But Sojourner Truth points out that his Negro's hour excludes Black women. There's a great stir about colored men getting their rights, but not a word about the colored women theirs. And if we give the men the rights, not the women, we're just exchanging one master for another, she said. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton fretted, if that word male be inserted into the Constitution, it will take at least a century to get it out. She'll only be wrong by 50 years. But what happens is it splits the women's rights movement. Lucy Stone, Antoinette Brown Blackwell, and others formed the American Woman Suffrage Association, and they work to support the 14th and 15th Amendments ratification, but also work for state and territorial amendments of for women's votes, figuring that'll be a stepping stone. And they have two very quick successes. In 1869, Wyoming, which is a territory, so the governor and the legislature can grant it without a vote of the all-male electorate, they say, let's go for it. Probably part of the reason was that they had a 6-to-1 male-female ratio, and they wanted to attract some more wives. Utah had a different reason. The Mormons were trying to solidify their power, and they had polygamy, so their families would have more votes than non-Mormon families. It would be reversed. And briefly, Washington Territory had it, but then Prohibition worries caused that to be reversed in the mid-80s. But then, despite many other attempts, they had no other victories. Meanwhile, the National Women's Suffrage Association said, let's try to see if we can make these amendments more broad in court. And so in 1875, a number of women across the country tried to vote in the presidential election to test that 14th Amendment, including Susan B. Anthony, the Women in Vineland, Sojourner Truth, many others. Susan B. Anthony gets arrested in Rochester, and when she tries to defend herself in court, the judge says she's incompetent to testify. This is a woman who had delivered speeches, like 300 speeches a year. She's fined $100, which she refuses to pay, but it's another case similar to hers, the Virginia minor case, that reaches the Supreme Court, which rules that the Constitution, when it confers citizenship, does not necessarily confer the right of suffrage. Meanwhile, New Jersey suffragists are continuing to try to get a broad interpretation of suffrage to include both male and all races and all genders. But the 1875 constitutional amendment enfranchises Black males only. In 1876, we have the first World's Fair in the Americas, in the U.S., as a centennial celebration in Philadelphia, and the National Women's Suffrage Association attempts to read their Declaration of Rights of the Women of the United States at the convention. They're refused, they're not allowed to do it, so they instead pass out copies of it and read it outside. But the day before, the American Women's Suffrage Association held a separate event, and Lucy Stone's husband said that we really should celebrate July 2nd as our Independence Day, because that was the day that the men of New Jersey, for the first time in the world's history, organized a state upon the principles of absolute justice. Incidentally, the only woman who really got a place of prominence at the World's Fair that year was the arm of the Statue of Liberty, which was brought to raise money for the pedestal. Well, in 1878, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which would later be called the Anthony Amendment, was introduced, identical to the 15th except for the last word. And apparently the Congress was not impressed. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote in her journal she was infuriated by the studied inattention and contempt of the chairman. It would be reintroduced each session for over 40 years. During this time, by the way, as I'd mentioned, Elizabeth Cady Stanton is living in Tenafly. Her house is a gathering place for reformers. She's focusing on that national amendment more than on the New Jersey side of things. And she, along with others, Susan B. Anthony and Matilda Gage, are writing the first 3 volumes of the history of women's suffrage right on her dining room table and urging the political parties to include suffrage in their platforms to no avail. But on November 2nd, 1880, she attempts to vote in Tenafly. The building she tried to vote in was only recently torn down despite an attempt by historical preservationists to keep it. But she cited our constitutions and said, I have perfect right to vote, whereas one of the poll inspectors said, I know nothing of constitutions, but I know in New Jersey no woman had voted in my day, and I cannot accept your ballot. And that basically was what was happening around the country, a distinct lack of progress. Meanwhile, other associations were starting to perk up women's interests, in particular temperance and women's clubs. In 1869, the Cirrhosis Club, the first women's club in the country, was founded in New York City. And 3 years later, the Women's Club of Orange became the first one in New Jersey, and dozens more would follow. And members would present and discuss papers which was a form of adult education that was completely denied to women because we had no women's colleges in the state. And the women's clubs created public high schools, libraries, educational opportunities for girls. And they saw suffrage as a way to support these civic goals and give women a voice in their government. Meanwhile, religious women found their voice in the temperance movement. Frances Willard, who was just an astonishing, energetic woman and leader of this movement, said prayer and education's not enough. We need the ballot to get laws that we enacted to get our things. And you can see here she is, she was actually a college president for a while, surrounded by her political equals, stereotypes of an idiot convict, an Indian, an insane person, all of whom were voiceless in this democracy. And she brought a huge membership into the women's suffrage movement, including because the Christian Temperance unions had a lot of segregated Black chapters. Quite a few Black women came into the movement that way. Well, the equality argument from the 1860s morphed into a moral justification. Women needed the vote because they would make our society better, more moral, with temperance, labor laws, conservation, and so forth. Meanwhile, in New Jersey, the New Jersey branch of the Women's Christian Temperance Union formed a suffrage committee in 1884, and 3 years later, in a very surprise move, nobody knows exactly how this happened, the legislature passed school suffrage unanimously. It was limited to rural schools where voting was just done, by acclamation on in open meeting. And we don't know why it happened. It may have been a deal to appease the temperance activists and not rile urban bosses. But nationally, because of the competition from these societies, the women's suffrage movement realized they had to consolidate to have any power at all. And so the two organizations merged into the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NASAW. And the daughters of the originators were some of the movers and shakers in getting that done. And our state societies coordinated with the new national society. And New Jersey was re-energized. There was a sense about to work on state suffrage here. But in 1894, there was a setback. The Supreme Court declared the 1887 school suffrage law unconstitutional because our Constitution in 1844 had said only males could vote for people. They could vote for appropriations, but not trustees. Well, that was a catalyst. The New Jersey Women's Suffrage Association did a campaign to get full women's suffrage on the ballot, but quickly learned that was dead in the water. Nothing was going to happen. So they settled on just trying to get a new amendment on school suffrage through the legislature. They'd have to get it passed through both the Assembly and Senate for 2 successive sessions before it could go to the voters. They do manage to do it. And in 1897, it's going to the electorate. There's a massive campaigning, incredible expenditure of money and effort, and endorsements from everybody who's everybody. And this amendment on school suffrage, which nobody thought was even controversial, was defeated. It was very disappointing. Meanwhile, on the national stage, after the merger, they had 4 quick successes. Wyoming became a state with its women's suffrage. They insisted, go Wyoming. That was terrific. And then in 1893, Colorado became the first state to enact through their electorate, through the males voting to allow women to join them in the vote. And they're also the first state that voted in women legislators. And then in 1896, Idaho and Utah, which by now no longer had polygamy, joined in. But then doldrums. There were dozens of campaigns, thousands of activists, and no more victories. And we were very disheartened and demoralized here in the state as well. And our leaders all died off. Lucy died in 1893, Elizabeth in 1902, Susan in 1906, Aunt Susan as she was called. One of her last public speeches, Susan B. Anthony stated, "Failure is impossible, but it would take a new generation to find that success." In New Jersey, 2 years after Susan B. Anthony's death, we saw the movement invigorated by some younger women, new generation, 2 in particular. Mina Van Winkle, who founded the Equality League for Self-Supporting Women of New Jersey as a parallel organization to one founded by the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Harriet Stanton Blatch, both of these organizations were bringing in working women, both factory working women and professional working women, into the suffrage movement, a movement that had been dominated by middle and upper class women with a lot of free time in the past. And that same year, a New Jersey Women Suffrage Association elected Clara Schley Lady, who was an incredibly strong leader. She re-energized the movement. She visited all the local leagues and got labor endorsement. And as I said at the beginning of this presentation, in 1910, she named me enrollment chair. That same year, two more New Jersey suffrage associations were formed, the Equal Franchise Society and the New Jersey Men's League. And that year, Harriet Stanton Blatch organized the first suffrage parade. It was held in New York, but a delegation of women from New Jersey attended. And it wasn't a big parade or a noisy parade. There weren't floats, there weren't bands, there were just women walking with banners. But it was a scary thing to do. In fact, Florence F. Foster, a fellow New Jersey suffragist, would recall, parading in the public streets, no lady, but we felt we must do it for the cause, and our problem was whether to tell our husbands before we marched or after. But this marching, this public speaking that started taking place, that was another innovation that we saw then from Harriet Stanton Blatch. That turned off some of our old allies. In particular, it became very divisive within the women's clubs who thought it was unladylike behavior. And so the state federation and the national federation stopped supporting suffrage as an organization. Individual women could certainly still do so. And the state wouldn't do so again until 1917, 2 years after the national came back into the fold. But also that same year, after 14 years with no victories, Washington became the 5th state. And the following year, after a massive campaign, the 4th in California, that too came on board, and it won by only an average of 1 vote per precinct. So anytime someone says your vote doesn't matter, remember California. Well, what happened with those things was that equal suffrage went from being moribund to having some sense of momentum, and the goal of the national organization was one eastern state. And January of 1911, Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated as the governor of New Jersey. He had a progressive agenda, but it did not include women's suffrage. December of 1911, Emmeline Pankhurst, militant suffrage from England, came to America, gave a number of lectures, including one in New Jersey for 2,500 people in Newark, the new hall there. And the 4 organizations, suffrage organizations, joined forces to establish a legislative committee, which introduced, by way of Senator William Gebhardt, who was a Democrat and a strong suffrage supporter from Hunterdon County, who had 2 daughters in the movement. He introduced the resolution into the Senate, where it was going to get a floor debate March 13th, 1912. Well, there was great excitement. For the very first time, New Jersey suffrage activists came to Trenton in person en masse. About 600 people in all, supporters and antis, quickly came in. The supporters spoke first. The head of our movement, Mrs. Gladdy, spoke of the social good from women's voting. And Miss Melinda Scott, who was a very prominent women's labor organizer, talked about how women needed the vote to improve working conditions and for pure food laws. And Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who you may have heard of, she's the very famous author of The Yellow Wallpaper. She was a very active suffragist from California, which, as I said, had just won women's suffrage. She pointed out women needed votes as much as men would if women had been making laws for men. But the antis were formidable. Among them was Mrs. Harriet Fisher, who was known as the Iron Woman because she was the owner of an anvil factory she'd inherited from her husband. She was the first woman factory owner in the United States, also the first woman to drive in an automobile all the way around the world. And she asserted, despite her own accomplishments, that women were being deceived in the promises held out to them under the ballot, and that a woman's place was in the home, as she told the New York Times. Miss Minnie Bronson, a very accomplished woman herself who traveled all over the world to world's fairs doing exhibits. She had a master's in math, all sorts of things. And the editor, but she was the editor of Women's Protest, an anti-suffrage newspaper. She argued suffrage would damage protections for women, working women. And she would later say that women would only vote for a good-looking man anyway. Our first attempt was defeated rather strongly, but we had learned how to lobby and we would be back. But it also served as a rallying call for the anti-suffrage movement. The New Jersey Association opposed to women's suffrage was formed a month later, and soon there were chapters across the state. That October, however, we had our first New Jersey parade. We had a brass band, we had almost 1,000 people, we had banners, we had speeches. The press thought it was the most important event since the inception of the suffrage movement in New Jersey. And among those who were in the procession was Antoinette Brown Blackwell of Elizabeth. Well, November 1912, I was elected, the following month, I was elected as the New Jersey Women's Suffrage President. At the time of my election, there were 28 leagues across the state with 1,200 members. In the next 8 years, we would grow that to 120,000, 100-fold. But that November of my election, our governor was elected President of the United States, and he would be heading to Washington on March 1st, 1913. Where he was about to meet his nemesis, also from New Jersey, Miss Alice Paul. She was a Quaker from Moorestown. She had gone to England to do graduate work in political science and instead gotten very much drawn up into the militant suffrage movement there. She was arrested. She joined in protest. She was arrested. She was force-fed. And when she returned, she said, unless women are prepared to fight politically, they must be content to be ignored politically. And she said, we need a lot of publicity. We need to work on this federal amendment. So she and Lucy Burns started that activism. And in late 1912, Alice and Lucy asked the National if they could revive their constitutional committee to work on the federal amendment. And they were told, go ahead, here's $10 as seed money, you have to raise the rest. So they did. And one of the things they planned was this grand suffrage parade on the eve of Wilson's inauguration, March 3rd. And as she's making parade preparations in Washington, we're working in Trenton to reintroduce the suffrage referendum. And publicity includes General Rosalie Jones and her suffrage army. You ready to see them? Here they are. So on February 10th, they left New York, came to Newark, and then started walking to Washington, D.C., hiking to Washington, D.C. And there they are passing through Newark. You see the weather is clear but very, very cold, and the footing is pretty icy. And after they come into to Trenton and deliver a suffrage message to the governor and legislature there on February 18th, which is when 2,000, this time, pro and anti-suffrage speakers and attendees are filling the hearing. Wilson does his best to dodge the women, but this time the measure passes in the New Jersey Senate because we've been able to persuade them they're not voting for suffrage. They're voting to allow the voters in New Jersey to decide on suffrage. Then it's down to Washington, D.C. for the march on March 3rd. We join that well over 5,000 women from across the world and the United States. New York City labor lawyer Inez Mulholland. Please don't talk up there or close doors. Inez Mulholland is on that white charger looking like Joan of Arc as she leads the parade. And it's a very well organized parade that sets off down Pennsylvania Avenue carrying flags and banners demanding give women the vote. But it turns to chaos as the estimated 500,000 spectators break through the ropes, start abusing the marchers, not only squeezing them, they're heckled, tripped, shoved, hair and clothes and banners are torn from the women, and the police police do nothing. The ambulances have to squeeze through these masses to reach the injured marchers. It's estimated 100 women were hospitalized, but the result is that the amendment gains national headlines, which thrills Alice. And that same week, you see right next to the headlines about the victory, you see that our amendment attempt has gotten through the assembly as well. So we spend the summer of 1913 campaigning for suffrage around the state. We have 3 women who are in a suffrage caravan. They eat, drink, and sleep in that wagon and go across the state to try to get publicity because, as I said before, the referendum has to be gotten through our legislature twice before it can go to the voters. The Men's League is active there. We're getting the clergy active. And then in August, we discover that the government, the New Jersey government, has not submitted the text of the amendment to newspapers as is required by law. We rush to Trenton, we talk to the governor, we talk to the legislature, we find out, oh, it was an oversight, there's nothing they can do, they have to do it again next year. Very frustrating. We suspected the oversight was nothing, not an oversight, but just a dirty trick, but there's nothing to do about it. We'll have to do it over again in 1914 and 1915. After our convention, it's back down to Washington, D.C. Alice Paul thinks that if a delegation of New Jersey women meets with their ex-governor, Woodrow Wilson, we will have more say than women from any other part of the country. So she urges us to go down there to have a meeting with him and urge him to support the federal amendment. He gives a very wishy-washy answer. He'll give it his consideration. Then it's back to Trenton on January 14, 1914. The New Jersey legislature again brings up the referendum, and this time it will easily pass both houses. But then we discover the Senate fails to have the results of the vote printed in their Senate journal as is required. But we noticed it in time. We were no longer political novices, and we made sure the erratum was added. But our opponents are no longer novices either. 2 anti-groups are now in existence. The New Jersey Association opposed to women's suffrage that had been formed the previous year, which was all female, was up to 15,000 members. And a much smaller but very powerful men's anti-suffrage league had also been formed. And I remarked, we haven't 1/10 enough active workers to carry on the present work as it should be carried on, and not 1/5 enough money. The antis are very strong here and are fighting us tooth and nail. We spend the summer of 1914 mobilizing, particularly in the shore towns, then as now. That's where New Jersey residents summered. And the goal was to elect a pro-suffrage legislature and our national candidates. At our convention, a lot of excitement. It's pretty clear we're going to be able to get the referendum through the legislature again early 1915. So now we turn to how do we get it through to the voters. And we hired 4 paid organizers. We have aggressive campaigns across the state planned. The suffrage resolution is introduced as the first bill in the 1915 session, easily passed, and a special election is set for October 19th. Now we have to persuade male voters. And that same year, we're going to be joined by our sisters in New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, who all had passed referenda. And the goal is at least one. These were the founding states in the 1800s. This is where suffrage had begun, and yet only Western women had won it so far. Our campaign slogan for all 4 states was victory in 1915. There were high hopes. We knew we needed to turn out a lot of male voters, lots of propaganda. Our organization distributed over 1.5 million pieces of campaign literature, as well as buttons, matchboxes, etc. We held parades, lectures, performances, automobile processions, ball games, anything to capture the attention and hopefully the sympathy of onlookers and male voters. We had a Cape Crusader dog in Long Branch. We had a suffrage boat on Lake Hopatcong. We had a suffrage torch that made its way across the Hudson from New York to New Jersey. And we had a suffrage camel that traveled the state. We emphasized in all our literature the social good that would come from women's votes. And African American efforts were particularly strong, led by the Reverend Florence Spearing Randolph, who'd organized 30 Black societies of the Women's Christian Temperance Union into the New Jersey Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. And she spoke in front of the New Jersey legislature. She was a very strong advocate. But the opposition was also very well funded. They got money from liquor, which was worried about prohibition, from manufacturing, which was worried about labor laws that would be enacted if women had the chance, getting rid of child labor, better hours, etc. From political parties who felt women were far less easily corruptible than male men. Remember, many men were allowed to vote who were new immigrants who didn't speak the language or could read a ballot, so they could just be told, mark the X here, and they would do whatever they were told if they were given a bribe. And finally, many women, I already mentioned, in the women's club movements and so far thought that it would be unladylike for women to vote, and said they were being represented by their husbands and their family. The opposition flooded the state with flyers claiming socialism and feminism would help to lay the axe at the taproot of Christian civilization. The political bosses teamed up with liquor and manufacturing interests, and bars, saloons handed out tickets saying, "Good for 2 drinks if women's suffrage is defeated." 2 weeks before Election Day, we were jubilant when President Wilson finally came out in support, but it was a kind of a wishy-washy support. He said he was supporting it as a citizen of New Jersey and not as the leader of the Democratic Party, and he was only supporting state referenda, not the federal amendment. And journalists were cynical. They basically said he had to support the state amendments because he was expecting the vote of all the women in the western states who'd gotten the vote, would, if he came out all against suffrage, that they would vote against him. Coverage was very, very limited because the war was raging in Europe. We really didn't know, even up to the end. We had high hopes, but they were defeated. In fact, rather, we were trounced. And it was an ominous signal because 3 weeks later, the campaigns in our sister states were also failures. We would have to wait 5 more years before reintroducing a referendum and starting the process again. But New York was allowed to start it again in the next legislature. And Carrie Chapman Catt, who was heading the New York organization and would soon become the president of the national, vowed that was what they were going to do. But the defeat of all 4 referenda decided Alice Paul. It cemented her belief that the state action was hopeless. It would take forever before women across the country would get suffrage if we depended on our state legislatures. So she wanted all the suffragists to focus energies on a federal amendment. And she had a petition campaign. Petitions were collected from across the country, delivered from San Francisco to New Jersey, and then went down to Washington, D.C. And you see this photograph of 500,000 signatures. Immediately after our defeat, a branch of Alice Paul's Congressional Union was opened in Newark, New Jersey. Alice Turnbull Hopkins and Julia Hurlburt became the heads. And that was a very activist organization. They traveled all around the state to demand federal action. But Alice Paul is impatient with the Democratic Party's refusal to support suffrage. And so in the summer of 1916, she forms the National Women's Party. That is a party of women who have the vote. So she can't be a member of her own party initially. A year later, it'll expand to include everybody. It sort of merges with the Congressional Union. But when it's initially started, she forms a party she can't be a member of. But what she does urge the party members to do, who are voters, is to vote against all Democrats and the president because they have failed to support the federal amendment. But that policy is very problematic to the National American Women's Suffrage Association and the New Jersey branch of it, of which I'm president, because we have friends in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party. In fact, our resolutions had been introduced in New Jersey by Democrats. So at the convention, which was held in August 1916 in Atlantic City, New Jersey, Carrie Chapman Catt said, we have to work on both. We need to be working on both federal and state action in order to make the federal amendment a campaign. We need to have pro-suffrage legislators in both parties and lobby Congress. Well, Wilson was reelected despite Alice Paul's party attempts because he said he would keep us out of war, and that was a winning slogan. And so when he comes back to Washington, January 9th, 1917, Alice Paul says it's time to do something new. And the thing she decides to do is initiate picketing of the White House. It's the very first time anybody has picketed the White House. And she asked women from across the country to volunteer to be silent sentinels. And this picture, which you may have seen, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? That is the chair of her New Jersey branch, Alice Turnbull Hopkins, picketing on New Jersey Day, January 30th, 1917. Initially, the pickets are tolerated. Some people admire them. The president even brings out or instructs his staff to bring out either tea or cocoa, different people say what, to warm them up on the cold days. People bring warm bricks for them to stand on. But a lot of people don't think it's wise. And after the declaration of war on April 6, 1917, many people think that they should stop, including Harriet Stanton Blotch, who was very active within the National Women's Party and had coined the term silent sentinels, for silently standing there with their banners. But she said, in a time of war, we cannot continue this. And she resigned from the organization. But Alice Paul said, no, it is important we continue picketing, particularly because the president is spouting hypocrisy. He's saying that the U.S. is going to war for democracy, but he's denying that democracy to half of his citizens at home. And the mood changes dramatically. The U.S. Committee on Public Information starts whipping up patriotism, and you're unpatriotic if you don't volunteer, donate, or do your part, and you're particularly unpatriotic. In fact, it becomes illegal to speak out against the war, and you could be fined or imprisoned. Well, on July 14th, 1917, Bastille Day, among the about, I think it was 14 women marching for liberté, égalité, and fraternité are New Jersey Women's Party leaders Julia Hurlburt and Allison Trumbull Hopkins. And while they're picketing for liberté, they are arrested. They are arrested, they're sentenced to 60 days in the Occoquan workhouse, but they're pardoned by President Wilson after only 3 days, probably because Allison's husband was Wilson's New Jersey campaign manager. But as the year goes on, the rhetoric gets more and more divisive. The banners tell the Russians they're being deceived by Wilson's words about democracy. They address Wilson as Kaiser Wilson, pointing out that Germany, at least, is giving its women the vote. And it leads to brutal attacks by bystanders and then arrests of these women. They're arrested for obstructing sidewalk traffic. So 500 people might just be descending on 6 silent picketers, but the picketers are arrested and they are thrown into horrible conditions, and they ask to be treated as political prisoners, and instead they're beaten, they're placed in solitary confinement. Alice Paul and many of the other prisoners are force-fed, they're not allowed visitors or messages. And November 15th, there's a night of terror. Lucy Burns is actually strapped to that, you see that jail door. Her arms are handcuffed and she is hung from the door all night long. Another woman is thrown against the cell and has a concussion. They think she's dead. In any event, newspapers publish these accounts of the treatment, and there's a public outcry, and the administration has to let them go. They can't afford to have one of these hunger strikers die in prison, particularly because many of these are very prominent women. And so right after Thanksgiving, Alice and 20 other prisoners are released. And if you want their story, I highly recommend Iron Jawed Angels, which is a video. Their convictions will indeed be overturned by court 3 months later by the U.S. court, which says that the mere act of assembling is not unlawful unless for an unlawful purpose. And that's the reason you can still picket today, is suffragists' wormy food and bedbug infested quarters and beatings and so forth led to our freedom of speech in this country. But meanwhile, the national organization was looking towards state campaigns, particularly New York. Harriet Stanton Blatch is using war phrases. American women have begun to go over the top. When men go warring, women go to work, pointing out all the different things that women are doing in defense of their country, and all they want is the vote. There's a huge parade showcasing over 1 million petition signatures, women nurses, women factory workers, other war efforts by the women, the huge number of bonds that have been bought by women, and Wilson's endorsement of state drives. And this time they are successful. New York becomes the first Eastern state and brings to the floor 45 electoral votes, a very big deal, the most in the country. And a number of Midwest states also win presidential suffrage that year. We tried for that in New Jersey, but it went nowhere. Well, women now have political power. There'll be a quarter of the women of the country will be voting in the 1918 elections, and even more in 1920. And more New Jersey women have become supportive as well. In the spring of 1917, the New Jersey State Federation of Women's Clubs finally came back on board and elected a suffragist, a staunch suffragist, as their president. So whether it was the political math or the picketers' imprisonment or some of both, we see that something interesting happens. For the first time in decades, the amendment will be leaving committee and coming up for consideration on the floor of both houses in January of 1918. And so on January 10th, 1918, the 40th anniversary of the day that Elizabeth Cady Stanton et al. Introduced the 16th Amendment, women line up long before dawn to see to get the gallery seats to watch the proceedings as it's introduced on the floor. They're not allowed to keep their knitting. They're all knitting socks and so forth for the troops. But I guess the knitting needles were considered dangerous weapons because a mound of bags built up. President Wilson addresses the House and says, we've made partners of women in the war, in suffering and sacrifice and toil, and we need to recognize this and with enfranchisement. There's massive lobbying, and it wins by exactly the 2/3 needed. If one vote had gone the other way, it would have failed. And there were heroics. Several congressmen left their hospital beds to vote. Tears and cheers in the galleries, but not all our New Jersey representatives were on board. So we kept up the pressure. We had a patriotic parade in Newark in April, and in May, the women's clubs in New Jersey passed a resolution urging the president to pressure Democratic senators to support the amendment. Because the Senate was still 11 votes short, and this has been made worse because during that year, which is the year where we start to see the Spanish flu, 10 senators died, including a supporter from New Jersey Senator Hughes. And despite telegrams, editorials, lobbying, and a last-ditch speech by President Wilson, when the Senate voted on September 30th, it failed by 2 votes. And despite the work of us in New Jersey to get pro-suffrage candidates, an anti was elected to fill Senator Hughes's remaining terms, although we got a pro for the full term that would follow for the 66th Congress. There was one last vote held to try to get suffrage in the Senate in February, but it lost by 1 vote. So had we been successful, we would have had women's suffrage through Congress 4 months earlier than it was. But the 66th Congress did convene in May, and it easily passed through the House. There had been a lot of pro-suffrage legislators voted there. In the Senate, there was a lot of debate and delay. The antis knew that if they delayed it long enough, it would make it harder to get the ratification. So there was a lot of that, and there was lots of lobbying. Finally, on June 4th, 1919, it passed the 19th Amendment. We'd had 3 more come through in the intervening 40 years, passed, and we had it through Congress. Now it was time to go through the state legislatures. We needed 36 because we had 48 states at the time. Many governors were reluctant to call special sessions. It took 14 months. It was a state-by-state struggle. Our neighbors in that 1915 campaign, their states quickly ratified it that summer. But it was more of a challenge here. We didn't think we had the votes. So we held an extensive campaign that fall, urging citizens to vote for pro-suffrage candidates in the elections of both parties. And we supported the Democratic candidate for governor because he promised he'd work to have New Jersey ratify the federal amendment. The Republican was not pledging either way. And we worked for him, and he won. Mr. Edward Edwards became governor. January 1920, our new New Jersey legislature began formal consideration. On February 2nd, it easily passed the Senate. But in this assembly, it still looked very dicey, and there were a lot of last-minute attempts, including this letter from a real man to a politician by the antis, calling women's suffrage the greatest menace now threatening the stability of American government. It was February 9th, the late night when late in the evening when the roll call began, and we waited with bated breath. It went on for several hours. The clock turned to the early morning of February 10th when finally the roll was finished and the resolution had passed 34 to 24. Basically, a lot of Essex County votes came over together, and women cheered. We were so excited. The antis didn't give up. They urged the governor to veto, which he pointed out is not something that it's legal for him to do. And furthermore, he was true to his campaign promise, and he quickly sent the resolution on to Washington, D.C. And here you see a grandfather, probably, or great-grandfather of one of our recent legislators, Senator Frelinghuysen, congratulating Betty Graham on our ratification. That April, a grand victory convention was held by suffragists in Newark, and our Women's Suffrage Association became the new nonpartisan League of Women Voters of New Jersey. I became treasurer, and Carrie Chapman Catt became the national president of the new organization. But this was possibly premature because the fight wasn't finished. In April, we had 35 states, but then Delaware went down to defeat. The Connecticut and Vermont governors refused to act on the measure, and most of the South refused to consider this because Jim Crow laws, they did not want any more Black voters. They'd already managed to keep most of their Black men from voting. So it looked like the border state of Tennessee was the only hope. And in August of 1920, 56 different groups of suffragists and anti-suffragists lobbied Tennessee legislators. They all gathered at the Hermitage Hotel where everybody was. The Senate easily ratified it, but in the House, it looked really, really bad. And every day it looked like there'd be fewer and fewer votes. The red roses signified the legislators who had agreed to vote for against the amendment. The yellow were the pro-suffrage, and it looked like we had a tie. And then Harry Byrne changed his vote. He voted aye. Women screamed and yelled and were so excited. Ratification had passed. And it was only a little while later, a few hours or maybe even a day or two later, when women found out what had happened. It turned out there had been a vote from Harry Byrne's mother. He was the youngest man in the chamber, only 25, which said, "Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Catt put the ratification. Vote for suffrage and don't keep them in doubt." And despite the fact he represented an anti-suffrage region of the state, he voted yes. And if you want the nail-biting fight, kind of minute by minute, I urge you to read The Women's Hour by Elaine Weiss. Well, on August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment, the Anthony Amendment as it was called, was officially adopted. It had been 72 years since Seneca Falls. Seamstress Charlotte Woodward was the only participant who had been at Seneca Falls who lived to see it, and she was too frail to vote. There had been 480 campaigns in state legislatures, 56 state referendums, 47 attempts to add suffrage to state constitutions, 19 campaigns for a federal amendment in 19 different Congresses to win women this right. And women finally had this right to vote, a voice in America's government. You can see when states did this. So all the gray states, including us, did not have it until 1920. But I should say white women. Native Americans weren't considered citizens and couldn't begin to vote till 1924 when they became citizens. And many states, including New Mexico, waited till very later. It's said that they didn't get in New Mexico till 1962. Chinese Americans were denied suffrage till 1943, Japanese Americans till 1952, and many states used literacy tests and other barriers, intimidation and so forth, effectively preventing many African Americans from voting until the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which sadly was eviscerated in this decade by the Supreme Court. Incidentally, the last state to ratify the 19th Amendment did not do so until 1981, and that was Mississippi, 1984. Only one pioneer suffragist actually got to cast her vote, and that was Antoinette Brown Blackwell. She had attended that first national convention, and she voted in Elizabeth. She was 95 years old. We still have a long way to go. As of our latest Congress, we've had 358 women serving versus nearly 12,000 men. And even though our latest Congress is called the Year of the Women, we're still under 24% of the 535 voting members versus over 51% of the population. As you know, we have not had a woman president or vice president, but hopefully that will soon change. If you look at the last election, incidentally, you see that the other thing we've got right now is a real diversity gap between parties. You can see it a little bit in the pictures and even more in the emojis. The last election had one woman elected from the GOP versus, quite a few women and African Americans from the Democratic Party. And you can see it in the graph as well. Republican female representation has now dropped below 10%, whereas Democrats are well over a third. And you can see we have diversity among the women as well. We've got a lot of different constituencies, races, nationalities, religions represented. But we still have a long way to go. Look at the messages these 2016 issues of Girls' Life and Boys' Life are giving our children. Enough said. Hundreds of women gave the accumulated possibilities of an entire lifetime. Thousands gave years of their lives. Hundreds of thousands gave constant interest and such aid as they could. Young suffragists weren't born. Old suffragists were dead. It's doubtful any man ever realized what the suffrage struggle came to mean to women. That's what Carrie Chapman Catt and Nettie Rogers Schuler wrote in 1923. So I say vote, organize, volunteer, and run for office. And I did all of those things. In the early 1920s, I was the president of the League of Women Voters of New Jersey. Sorry, that's our treasurer of the League of Women Voters for a year. And then I felt I needed to be active in partisan politics to have a real effect on legislation. So I got very active in the New Jersey Women's Republican Club, which was more progressive in those days. And I worked on legislation to get women on all political committees, on juries, on state boards, and to get protection for night work for women. But I ended up breaking with the party because I did not like their support. I did not like the fact they were pulling away from prohibition, and I did not like the dishonesty within the party. And I was ousted from the party for speaking up. In 1925, the same year, my husband filed for divorce. Interestingly enough, he had supported my suffrage work, but said I was neglecting him because of party politics. I think the neglect had more to do with his affections of his secretary, who he married 6 weeks after our divorce. But in any event, in 1928, I would run for Senate from New Jersey in the Republican Party primary as a dry candidate, but I was defeated. And I retired at that point from politics and died a little under 2 decades later. So I'm going to just finish up with a little fun movie that reviews suffrage for everybody. And then I'll take everybody's questions.
Now you have heard of women's rights and how we try to reach new heights if we're all created equal. That's us too. Yeah, but you will probably not recall that it's not been too long at all since we even had the right to cast a vote. Well, sure, some men bow down and call us misses. Yeah. Let us hang the wash out and wash the dishes. But when the time rolled around to elect a president, what did they say, sister? What did they say? They said, see you later, alligator. And don't forget my mashed potatoes, cause I'm going downtown to cast my vote for president. But we were suffering until suffering. Not a woman here could vote no matter what age. And the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. And now we pull down on the lever, cast our ballot, and we endeavor to improve our country, state, county, town, and school. Those pilgrim women who braved the boat could cook the turkey, but they could not vote. Even Betsy Ross, who showed the flag, was left behind that first election day. What a shame, sister. Then Susan B., Anthony, and Julia Howe, Lucretia Mott, they showed us how they carried signs and marched and lines until at long last the law was passed. Oh, we were suffering until suffering. Not a woman here could vote no matter what age. Then the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. And now we pull down on the lever, cast our ballot, and we endeavor to improve our country, state, county, town, and school. Yes, the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. Yes, the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. All right, we got it now. Since 1920, Sisters Unite.
So if you want to learn more about all of the things I talked about today, there's a special issue of Garden State Legacy. It's available online. You can find the link at my website, tellingherstories.com, which is a fuller discussion of the things I talked about today, reclaiming our voice. Also talks about African American, Jewish American immigrant suffragists in the state, the anti-suffrage movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's attempt to vote, our suffrage torch, and going all the way back to the petticoat electors and all of the things that happened surrounding that. So I hope you'll take a look at that. As was mentioned at the beginning of the program, I also have the book Remembering the Ladies, which looks at the national scene, and two programs relating to that, Pickets and Persistence, which looks at the fight for the national amendment, and Remembering the Ladies, which is just a leap through American political life with women. And I also have, as was mentioned, programs on Emily Roebling and her work on the Brooklyn Bridge, on early female aviators, and on Juliet Gordon Low, Crazy Daisy, the founder of the Girl Scouts. So I just want to finish with one last slide. This is a poem or a quip that was written by Alice Duer Miller. She wrote these for newspapers and collected them in a book called Our Women People, a book of rhymes for suffrage times. And it goes like this. Father, what is a legislature? A representative body elected by the people of the state. Are women people? No, my son, criminals, lunatics, and women are not people. Mother, what is a feminist? A feminist, my daughter, is any woman now who cares to think about her own affairs, as men don't think she oughter. So thank you so much for having me here today. And I'll just leave you with this, which is an interesting map of when women got the right to vote around the world, where we stand with that. So now I'm going to come back to you and see if there are any questions. So let's see. Here we go. Let's see. There we go. I can see me now. Anybody have any questions that came up or comments? Dead silence. Anybody still there?
Yeah.
Let's see. See.
I hear you, Andrew.
Great. Did anybody have any, were there any, let's see, questions or chat? I don't think I see anything. Let's see.
Here's a question. The early aunties, Harriet Fisher, Minnie Bronson, seemingly accomplished and educated, no doubt due to struggles fought and won by earlier women. What was the basis for their opposition?
There was a sense there. There was a feeling among the aunties. It was a sense that it was an unlike ladylike thing to do. That it wasn't part of their biblical or their feminine role to be involved in to be involved in state affairs. That the women's domain was the family and the home, and to talk about to be outside. And it was interesting because some people who had been part of the movement, and particularly the women involved with women's clubs who were doing all these things for their community, they were with the movement for a long time. And then many of them pulled away because of the tactics that when the movement moved out of the parlor and into the streets with parades, with public speaking, they thought that was so outrageous that they pulled out. And yet it's probably those tactics that led to the final victory, because as long as you were just talking to the converted over a tea party, you were not going to actually affect the legislature, as long if you were lobbying. But even up to the end, it's one of the reasons that Alice Paul's party had evoked such anger from many of the mainstream suffragists, was they felt that her tactics were so unladylike, so improper, that it would lose them support that they had worked so hard to get by saying that we can both be ladies, we can both be women, and be, trusted politically. But yeah, there's a much deeper look at that in the article in the in that issue of the magazine, Reclaiming Our Voice. I wrote the overview article and I helped edit that magazine, but that article is by another author who did much more research on that. Any other questions? I hope this was interesting. I hope there were, as I said, laughs and groans and not too many snores, but it's really hard to know when I'm sitting here and you're there. So if anybody does have anything they want to share, does anybody have any personal memories of a family member who may have spoken of the first time that, say, a grandparent, a grandmother, or great aunt or something voted, and the significance that had for them?
Somebody said parades and street easier to understand as unladylike than teaching math. Thank you for this excellent presentation.
Well, it's so funny that math teacher and that woman who went all around the world, she had an incredible job. She was an auntie, a very prominent auntie. She ended up editing the Auntie Journal. And then the factory owner, the hypocrisy, and who landed on what side of the issue is really interesting to contemplate.
Carol, I found this very interesting and I want to thank you for it. I didn't know all that New Jersey stuff, and I feel like especially since I've been at the library and been able to have people do talks, I found out a little bit more about New Jersey. We had done Alice Paul and that, so I knew a little bit more, but nothing like this. It was very good. And when you brought up the woman who did go around the world in a car, we actually had a talk done on her a few years ago. So I was like, oh, I know that lady. But yes, I mean, yes, I'm the organizer, and I guess maybe you could say I'm patting myself on the back, but I'm not.
Yeah.
I want to say thank you to you, because for me, this was a really good presentation, and I just learned a lot, and I enjoyed it as I was learning it. And for me, when I'm learning and enjoying it, that's a good thing, because then I'm going to better remember it.
That's wonderful. I'm thrilled, Cindy. I met a woman who told me about that at a Ewing presentation I did of this, BC before coronavirus. And she mentioned about that she knew more and had done something about that book or about that lady who'd gone around the world, Mrs. Fisher. But and I said, oh, the next time you do a program, I would love to hear about it, but I don't know that she's doing
That is
the programs
exactly
right.
who I had. I can't remember what her name was, but it was her. I think she was the great granddaughter. She was related in some way to her. And it was a very interesting presentation for that day and age for a woman to go around the world with a butler, and they picked up a monkey in one of the countries.
Yeah, initially it said, one of my sources, it said drove around the world. And then I learned, no, she had a driver, but still, this is not, an easy little journey. Even if you do have a butler, you're going some pretty wild places. So yeah, I know, interesting stories. There are three, the New York Times today had 3 articles. I don't know if they were all today, but they were gathered or promoted today about women in the suffrage movement. And the advertisement that's right there is promoting Mercedes-Benz, who, from Mercedes-Benz, I guess, is promoting Mercedes-Benz. But she was a very active early car driver. So, and so,
All right.
all things.
We have a few
Anything
more
else?
questions.
Anybody,
Yeah.
any other
Any other
questions?
question there?
We can
Yeah.
unmute people if people want to talk.
Everybody's muted, but we have people submitting questions in. So
Oh, good.
following the 19th Amendment, Republicans won in the election of 1920 and held
Mhm.
power for the following decade, even though Democrats with Woodrow Wilson supported the amendment, at least at the end. Do you think women voters were important in this change?
It's very interesting. The Republicans at the time were considered the more progressive party. And in fact, they came on to the amendment. They endorsed the amendment before the Democrats did. That's why Alice Paul was targeting Democrats, and also because Democrats had been in charge, had been in control. But in 1920, women and along with the electorate voted Republican, and it became much more, our country became much more conservative over the course of the decade. And what they discovered was women were voting just like their men. They're really, for about 3 or 4 years, there was a lot of women legislation introduced by both parties, including an act that is something, it's a hyphen act for women and children. And these acts were given a lot of consideration. A lot of legislation took place because the legislators thought that women would vote them out if they didn't support women's issues. But it turned out women voted party, whatever their family party was, rather than voting on an issue basis. And by the end of the decade, both parties were ignoring women in terms of doing things, and they even repealed that act that had passed in the early 1920s. There was such a lot of energy at the beginning of the decade. And Alice Paul used it working to try to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed. That was first proposed in 1923. Of course, it finally got through Congress in the early 1970s, and then we've been almost 5 decades trying to get state passage of that, thanks to Phyllis Schlafly. But the other things we got, early in the decade, there was a law that restored citizenship to women. Before this, if a woman married a non-American citizen, she lost her American citizenship. If he died or they got divorced, she was stateless. She had no citizenship. So they passed an act that was a big act that was on the women's agenda early in the 1920s as well. But then later on, there were just no really women-centric legislation because the parties basically decided they didn't have to anymore. Does that answer your question, or did I ramble too much? person who was asking? Was that what you were wondering about? But yes,
Yes.
there's a lot. One of the things, the other thing that is that if Tennessee had not ratified it, it's not absolutely clear we would have the 19th Amendment. Because after the 19th, as I said, after World War I really drew to a close, there was a very conservative turn to the electorate, and it's not clear that women would have made it later on. It's a little bit like the Equal Rights Amendment in that there was a burst of enthusiasm after Congress ratified it, overwhelmingly, by the way, and bipartisanly. And then for about a year, there were lots and lots of ratifications. And then the antis revved up and drew it to a halt, and then got some of the states to say, oh, we ratified, but we didn't really meet it. We want to pull out our ratification, which isn't probably legal. But you saw that also with the 19th Amendment, this kind of swell of conservatism that came after the ratification, after the passage of the amendment through Congress, trying to defeat it. Any other questions?
Looks like this is, I remember this exhibit about Trenton Entourage Motors around the world in 1909, and there's a link that somebody sent.
Oh, I'd love to see that. That'd be great. If you're able to share that with me, I'd really like to have it. I don't have that.
I can grab it for you.
I don't know
I
if I
believe
can.
that may have to do with Alice Ramsey, because somebody said Alice Paul, not same as Alice Ramsey, and they are
Correct.
not. Alice
Absolutely.
Ramsey was the woman who drove from coast to coast, evidently. I'm
Correct.
looking on.
She was right, and that's different from Mrs. Fisher, who was driven around the world.
Right,
Alice
right.
Ramsey was the first one to drive coast to coast, and then Alice Paul had two women from San Francisco drive coast to coast with those petitions. They were not driven by Alice Paul herself. Alice Paul was kind of the general. She was in Washington, D.C., directing traffic. In another program I do Pickets and Persistence, War Service, and Women's Suffrage. I do that as Jeanette Rankin. And Jeanette Rankin participated in the 1914 caravan of cars. I think it was 70 some cars from around the country drove to Washington, D.C. to try to convince Wilson and Congress to take up the amendment. Actually, I think at that point it had gotten onto the floor of one of the houses, so they went to give it some pressure there. They presented petitions. They'd gone across the country. This is a time when the roads, I think there are like 200 miles of paved roads in the entire country. There's not, it's not great roads, but women are coming all the way across the country. And Jeanette Rankin and her friend Mary Land go together, drive like 2,000 miles from Montana to Maryland for this, and then join this parade of cars to the Capitol. And apparently they hand the petitions off to Congress, and Congress says, thanks. That's it. So, but there were Alice Paul was she always thinking, how can I publicize this? How can I give this issue more publicity? And in addition to the things we talked about, the parade, the cars, the petition drives, they had a big stand going at the 1915 World's Fair, which is in San Francisco. Sorry, no, Yukon. That was the one in Seattle. They had a big thing going on there. So yeah, lots and lots of different things going on. So. Anything
Andrew, I don't see anything else. Do you see anything else?
No, nothing yet. We can wait a few more minutes and see if anybody has any questions to submit in the questions box.
I mean, I can certainly ask a question here. Was there something surprising you learned today that you didn't know before that you're going to go home tonight or whatever and tell somebody, or I guess many of you are at home, are going to go to, say tonight, today I had no idea. Any I had no idea moments that people want to share, or anything else that they want to share from this?
Somebody said, still wondering about the initial lost paperwork in New Jersey, where the politicians tried to pull a fast one during the initial early work.
Yeah, the
They said it
rule
was a dirty trick.
was that 3 months before an election, anything that would be on the ballot had to be publicized in the newspapers. This was, submitted. It was supposed to be submitted by you guys actually probably know the people in Trenton better than I do, but whoever the registrar of the legislature or whatever, or the governor's office, I'm not quite sure which, has to submit anything to the newspaper. So if there is going to be an amendment on the ballot or something like that, it has to be sent to the newspapers 3 months before any election, so that the people being elected, the people doing the election, can ask, the politicians, how do you stand on this issue? And August comes around, and I think it was a publisher from Long Branch. It was one of the shore newspapers, writes, or telephones, the telephone was available then, contacts, it probably was me. It was probably contact directly to Lillian, saying, we've not received this from the government. It's supposed we should have gotten it by now. At which point, New Jersey Women Suffrage Association contacts the governor's office, and they say, sort of, oops, oversight. We didn't mean to do it. And there's apparently a lot of grumbling at the convention about it, and they try to meet with the legislature, the chair of the assembly or whatever, and they're told it's too late. 90 days have passed. There's no way to get it in deadline within. So it was very interesting, because the first when I was first doing the research for this program, before I discovered the amazing dissertation, which I cite in my in the article Reclaiming Our Voice, there's a dissertation by Delight Dodiak called Education in Agitation, and it was behind but behind paywalls. You couldn't get it unless you were affiliated with the university and had ProQuest available to you. And there were 2 copies or 3 copies in the state, none of which were circulatable. One, it was held at Rutgers, one was held in Newark. And it's like an 800-page dissertation. Oh, and one is at the state library down there, because Debbie sent me some pages from it, but I couldn't read the whole thing. And I finally got in touch with Delight, and I said, this seems like there's such great information, but nobody has access to it. And all these people who are writing, because there's the Alexander Project, which is people crowdsourcing biographies of suffragists. And for instance, the information about Lillian Feickert didn't have a whole lot of the information. I knew about Lillian Feickert because I'd gotten it from this dissertation. Anyway, I got in touch with Delight, who's in her 80s, is living in Massachusetts, and I said, this is so hard to get. Is there any way you might want to try to make it more available? And we discovered that if she paid about $100 to ProQuest, they would put it open access. And I said, I'll pay that $100. I'll just use one of my fees from one of my programs. I'd be happy to pay for this to get it out there so people. She said, no, I'm 80 years old, 80 whatever years old. This is my legacy. I want to put it out. So now you can read that dissertation, and all is which to say, when I was reading in a lot of other sources, nothing explained why it passed, even though it had to pass 3 times. It passed in 1913, it passed in 1914, and it passed in 1915. It was only when I read her dissertation that I discovered about the monkey business of 1913. So there's a lot more detail there. It's huge. You realize, if you can write an 800-page dissertation about the women's suffrage movement in New Jersey, just how enormous this operation was. How, I don't call it a battle for the vote. It was a war. It was a 72-year long war. And many of the battles were fought in New Jersey or with New Jersey, people who had New Jersey ties. When I wrote, Remembering the Ladies from Patriots and Petticoats Presidential Candidates, I had no idea that Lucy Stone had spent about 15 years in New Jersey and basically cut her suffrage teeth here. I had she had made lectures before that when she was on the road, but she did her legislative teeth here before moving back to Massachusetts and being active in the New England Women's Suffrage Association for the last 20 years of her life. But even then, she was pretty sick by then, so her real active years were down here. But they're glossed over in the in biographies of her, or at least short biographies of her. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was here from 1868 to 1885. That's a huge portion of her active life. We all think of her at Seneca Falls, but she was only there for a few years. Alice Paul, of course, people usually do know that she was born and raised around here. But the petticoat electors, if they're even talked about at all, it's a little footnote, but there was a really active voting movement in New Jersey, and it's usually overlooked. And it was remembered, it was known about, because the early suffragists recalled that we had the vote once in America and lost it. And we were the first place, as Lucy Stone's husband, Henry Blackwell, says in that 1876 speech he makes on July 3rd. July 2nd was a Sunday, so he did it July 3rd so that he wouldn't speak on the Lord's Day. But he said July 2nd should be our centennial, because that was the first time all people were allowed to vote, which wasn't quite true because married women weren't allowed to, and people without property weren't allowed to. But at least it was more universal than it would be for a very, very long time. And certainly women did vote. It had been thought for a long time that and only a very few women voted. And then the Museum of the American Revolution, a couple of researchers found voting rolls that were donated just 3 or 4 years ago, were donated to the museum down in Trenton. These rolls had been in somebody's clerk's, attic or something. They were not in a publicly accessible place, and these were voting rolls from Montgomery Township in Somerset County and surrounding areas. And they found that anywhere from 7 to 14% of the names were identifiably female. And as I said, they also had that one name that was definitely Black, Negro, as they called it. But there may have been more because many didn't specify that on the rolls. The other thing they found was that women came in groups. They came, lots of women from the same family or family and neighbors. So if you think about male voting in those days as being this male place to be, they probably found comfort and power in numbers. And there was an article about that was in the paper, in the Star Ledger this week, and also a similar article that I think might have been the New York Times. So look for it. I also link to a lot of these things on my website. So when I find a very useful article, I always put it up there if you want to look for more information.
All right, everybody, I'm going to call this. I want to thank you for spending your time with us. Carol, I want to thank you so much for the presentation and spending your time with us. I want to thank Andrew for all the logistical things that he's done. And, we're just very happy, and it's really good information. And Carol has given us permission to be able to put this up on our YouTube channel. So we will hope to do that in the next few days. For those of you who might like to review it or, you know, concentrate on one aspect of it or just hear it over again. So
And that
thank you.
allows you to go back and look at slides, which is nice because of course there's a lot of information there. So if there's anything you need, but similarly, if there's anything that came up that you're curious about afterwards, you didn't want to talk about in public or whatever, you have my email, please contact me. I'd be more than delighted to answer as I can, if I can. All right.
Right. Very good. Thank you so
The
much.
big thing is go vote. Register
vote.
people to vote. We worked really hard for this and can't take it for granted.
Right.
All right. Good
Thank
night.
you.